Hello everyone, and welcome to my KIN 515 presentation on podium results tracking. My name is Bailey Monroe, and today I'm going to present you with data-backed evidence that will shape how our coaches will develop Canada's future Olympic and Paralympic swimmers, medalists, and champions. I'll begin today by identifying the general context of our podium pathway in swimming and describing the means through which high-performing swimmers are currently evaluated. Next, I'll be talking about key performance benchmarks, and more specifically the ones that appear to have the highest impact on overall swimming performance. Finally, I'll be providing the podium results trajectories that can be produced using these powerful metrics so that we can continue our work of producing the next era of Canada's Olympic and Paralympic gold medalists in swimming. As referenced in Swimming Canada's appropriate athlete development document released in 2020, the podium pathway is about developing high-performance athletes capable of winning at the highest levels of international competition and bringing home medals from Olympic Games, Paralympic Games, or World Championships. Strictly speaking, Swimming Canada considers the podium pathway to include the train to compete and train to win stages of athlete development, although the scope of their national program also includes train to train athletes. It's worth noting that the definitions of these stages as applied to the podium pathway are considerably more focused than in other literature. When we talk about train to compete athletes in the context of the podium pathway, we're talking about next-gen athletes that have been highlighted on national development teams. Some NSO-endorsed documents describe train to compete as more of a post-PHB biological stage, but in this context, the stage is really for dedicated and identified athletes. The sentiment is echoed even louder in the description of train to win, where you could count on one hand how many swimmers are truly supposed to be in that stage. We see the same problem in our own clubs, where athletes are progressed through the pathway to fit the needs of the club rather than the needs of the athlete, and not every club is the perfect training environment for a highly talented athlete, which is why we have national programs and high-performance centers to provide quality programming in the swimmer's home environment. It's a delicate balance between investing resources in the skilled and reliable swimmers that are going to produce results while guiding the next generation of Canadian athletes towards excellence. Provincial programs fill the gap at the train-to-train level by providing experiences such as regional camps and opportunities at local high-performance centers. Now, let's talk about the role of various competitions and how they fit into the podium pathway for swimming in Canada. In general, Swimming Canada's competitive structure is well aligned with the podium pathway and international opportunities. Junior national level programming is offered for girls aged 13 to 17 and for boys aged 14 to 18. The FINA World Junior Swimming Championships, which serve as the apex of competition for the junior swimmer, used age groups of 14 to 17 for girls and 15 to 18 for boys. Other meets, such as the Ontario Junior International in December of each year, serve as opportunities for national team staff to evaluate promising young swimmers and their coaches. The primary avenue to qualify for exciting meets such as Junior Worlds is by competing at the Canadian Swimming Trials, which is offered in April of every year. Finally, there's typically a national event offered at the end of the summer, which in recent years has featured a combination of junior and senior athletes. Swimming Canada has the strong desire to see athletes produce performance on demand in specific windows that are aligned with senior meets such as Short Course Worlds, the Commonwealth Games, and even the Olympics. One of the strong advantages of having such a consistent competition cycle is that it provides a clear pathway for developing athletes to gain relevant experience while progressively increasing the level at which they are competing. And the junior athletes that are competing against senior athletes at events like nationals get access to the same resources as the country's top swimmers, which means that we're able to gather data and develop benchmarks that help guide the development of the next generation of Canadian swimmers. To finish providing context for the podium pathway for Canadian swimming, let's talk about how we evaluate swimmers. As I alluded to before, athlete development is much more than just a chronological or biological age. There are skills that young swimmers must develop if they have a serious interest in progressing along the podium pathway towards competitive excellence. Strong development in areas will enable athletes to shift their focus to stage-appropriate activities rather than playing catch-up all the time with their development. In championship swim training, legendary coach Bill Sweetenham and Canada's high-performance director John Atkinson describe the importance of aerobic and endurance training before maturation, specifically for female swimmers in specific events. They also highlight the importance of developing feel and efficiency measured by the number of strokes that swimmers take per length. Senior athletes with a strong background in this area will require less stimulus to maintain those abilities and can then prioritize the development of race-specific elements as they get older. This is directly aligned with the messaging that has been sent through Swimming Canada's middle distance workshops across the country. But swimming is a very technical sport with a large economy component. There's a lot more to it than simply building an engine. And the physiology and biomechanics of swimming are deeply intertwined. A stroke isn't worth much if it can't be held together using aerobic energy, and the ultimate engine is ultimately of no value when placed in a high-drag vehicle. It's well understood that swimmers should focus on developing technique as early as possible, ideally in the learn to train stage where they're highly neuroplastic and have high potential for improvement. Unfortunately, the practical refinement of swimming technique is often a highly qualitative exercise, with many coaches having different opinions as to how certain strokes should be swum. General principles suggest that swimmers want a stroke that is able to effectively produce propulsion while minimizing drag to only what is essential and unavoidable for swimming at that certain speed. And minimizing drag is the most important element as swimmers continue to get faster and faster due to the polynomial relationship between drag and velocity. Therefore, this combination of skilled movement that is sustainable under load and duress while still being scalable to higher intensities is ultimately what we are looking for in a swimmer. Given that we know there are so many crucial parts that make up an elite swimmer, it may seem rather simplistic and even shallow to try to reduce what we're doing down to a simple number. And yet, swimming time encompasses everything that a swimmer does in the water and provides instant feedback on the overall quality of the performance. Because of the complexities of swimming, simple outcome variables are what we are left with, as something that we are able to analyze on a large scale with millions of data points readily available. To identify promising young swimmers with the potential for future podium success, Swimming Canada partnered with Canadian Tire Sports Analytics and owned the Podium to develop on-track times. These time standards are meant to capture every swimmer that has the potential to represent Canada internationally and provide a system of prioritizing resources to the athletes with the highest probabilities of success given those resources. The performance levels and progression rates of swimmers can be measured in relation to the on-track times for their specific age, gender, event combination, which provides evidence of tracking towards podium performance. Recognizing that total time isn't everything and the need to dive deeper into the nature of these performances, companies like RaceTech provide race analysis services that relate swimmer benchmarks to statistical models with progressions towards excellence. These services are both descriptive and prescriptive. They're capable of telling swimmers what they did in the race as well as how they might change what they're doing to reach higher levels of performance. These models can then be applied to training scenarios so skills can be practiced accurately in the daily training environment. However, with all of the information available nowadays, sometimes it can be easy to lose sight of the essential elements that have the strongest relationship to performance. These race models essentially give you all the information you could possibly want, but an exaggerated focus on specific elements of their output could result in compromised development. Now that we've gained an understanding on the general context of the podium pathway for swimming in Canada, as well as how competitions and swimmer evaluations facilitate strategic investment, let's take a closer look at key performance benchmarks, and most specifically, the ones that I believe have the highest impact on swimmer performance. In swimming, there's a few distinct classes of metrics which I've chosen to split into the following three categories: available metrics, accessible metrics, and complex metrics. Available metrics are generated automatically by the electronic timing system that registers every competitive swimming result. Central, publicly available databases of this information exist, and as a result, this type of information is massively downloadable using web scraping techniques or a designated API. Data such as swimmer name, date of birth, country, club, meet, location, date, course or pool length, event, time, splits, pace, and reaction time are all variables that are included in this widely available data. Next, we have accessible metrics. Due to their specificity to the swimmer that generated them, there are incentives to keep this data private. Although you cannot readily find a public database of this information, they can be generated with relative ease using either manual measurement or, more recently, advanced computer vision techniques. These metrics are growing in availability due to the introduction of swim-specific wearables such as Form Smart Goggles, Triton Wear, or the Trainee Sense Smart Paddles. They include important pieces such as underwater time, dolphin kick counts, stroke rate, stroke count, stroke length, and breathing patterns. Finally, we have derived or complex metrics. These metrics are combined with multiple data points in an ensemble method to paint a bigger picture that is perhaps more accurate to what is actually happening. Deriving these metrics typically require the level of context and feature engineering that is only available to NSOs with designated data science teams. What I'm going to provide you with today is ironically a simple, complex metric, which I've decided to call relative stroke length, or RSL. It can be defined as the length of a swimmer's stroke divided by either their wingspan or height. Using one or the other produces two different metrics, which provides either more of a super relative or a more absolute approach. But before we dive deeply into RSL, we need to understand how all the pieces of a race come together and how they can be practiced accurately in the daily training environment. A typical race analysis includes several metrics such as total time, splits, velocity, stroke length, stroke rate, and stroke count. Some of these metrics are more useful than others. Swimmers are not typically able to report their instantaneous velocity, but anyone can count their strokes or compare their stroke tempo to that of a metronome or an internal reference. At the end of the day, all of these variables are outcome variables to some degree because they are an abstraction of what the swimmers are actually doing in the water. As simple and available as total time may be, it is the sum of infinitely many variables. Breaking total time down into splits provides a better idea as to how the race was swum, but the time on that specific length was still spent doing something that is not captured by that simple metric. I believe that the simplest way to break a length down into a level of granularity that can be meaningfully analyzed is by dividing it into segments based on activity and time. Each length begins with a push, either off of a wall or a starting block. Swimmers then spend time underwater up to a maximum of 15 meters before they begin swimming. They continue swimming until they reach the wall and perform a turn or a finish, which is the part of the last stroke. The delay between the push-off and the first kick, the number of dolphin kicks, and the rate they're executed at are completely quantifiable, as are the equivalent metrics for surface swimming. But if we compare swimmer metrics to one another in a vacuum, we risk a serious misunderstanding of what is actually going on in the water. It's easy enough to tell a swimmer that their velocity dropped or their stroke count was too high, but performing meaningful race analysis at the levels covered by the podium pathway requires significant understanding and nuance. If you tell a swimmer to take one less stroke, how should they do that? Should they take 2 more dolphin kicks at 0.2 seconds per kick instead of taking 1 stroke at 0.5 seconds? Is the event in the context of combining speed and efficiency, such as the 200 freestyle, or is it a short duration sprint, like the 50-meter freestyle? And how good is the swimmer at underwater kick? This is all to illustrate the importance of prioritizing key performance benchmarks that have the highest impact on performance. Let's take a look at what those metrics are. When comparing the performances of novice swimmers to elite swimmers, the efficiency and economy-driven metrics of stroke count and stroke length reign supreme. The simple intuition behind this assessment is that essentially anyone can move their arms as fast as Michael Phelps, but very few people are able to swim as efficiently or sustain that efficiency at the relevant stroke rate. Stroke count represents the number of strokes that a swimmer takes on their way to the other side of the pool, while stroke length describes how far they go on every stroke. Stroke count is an immediately useful metric because anyone can count their strokes and compare their stroke count to a benchmark. However, stroke counts can be cheated by things such as underwater distance and disregarding elements of the stroke such as timing or kick count while still operating between the rules. For example, a swimmer might choose to get a stroke count of 0 by simply kicking to the other side of the pool without using their arms. But while this may be clever, it does not demonstrate real improvements in swimming efficiency. Fortunately, elite swimmers have an incentive to do what's best for their performance, so more often than not, these performances contain reasonably optimal data to analyze. Stroke length is a little closer to what the swimmer is actually doing in terms of the net effect of the propulsive and drag forces within their stroke applied through a rate. But both stroke length and stroke count can be highly variable between two swimmers, specifically swimmers of different sizes. Stroke length is a measure of how well you're able to move your body through the water. Because it's you moving your own body, it's somewhat of a relative metric already, and is often connected to other metrics of relative strength in the upper body. But by taking it one step further and comparing stroke length relative to height, or wingspan, RSLH or RSLW, respectively, the dispersion of the values is reduced significantly and is even condensed into a reasonable range. For example, legendary American distance swimmer Janet Evans would take 47 strokes per length in her 800 freestyle, while Allison Schmidt would take 34 in her 200 freestyle from a dive. I purposely selected apples and oranges, different distances, dive and a push, to illustrate a point. This represents a difference in stroke counts of 38%. Next, we account for the fact that Janet Evans is only 1.65 meters tall, about 5'5", while Allison Schmidt is 1.85 meters tall, around 6'1", which is a difference of 12%. Finally, we see relative stroke lengths with respect to height of 58% and 64% respectively. That's a difference of only 10%, which means that their difference in relative stroke length with respect to their height is less than their difference in height, even when comparing across events from a dive to a push from 1988 to 2012. Therefore, I believe that relative stroke length is a new metric worth investigating. We understand that swimming speed can be expressed as the product of stroke length and stroke rate. And before, I alluded to how stroke length is the result of propulsion, drag, and time. In 2019, I described a method of estimating the power and drag components of a swimming stroke, using a differential equation to model the initial velocity and decay elements of breaststroke kick. When swimmers generate propulsion, the delay before their next movement provides an opportunity for them to continue moving forward using their previous momentum. And in swimming, the amount of time that we spend on each stroke is quoted as a stroke rate, representing the number of stroke cycles that a swimmer takes per minute. By slowing down the stroke rate, swimmers give themselves more time to move forward in a gliding environment, thus increasing stroke length. But it's the interaction of propulsion and drag that creates the underlying function that describes the quality of the stroke. And extending the time by slowing down the stroke rate is simply stretching out the curve's time parameter and lowering average velocity. The goal should be to maximize propulsion while minimizing drag, so that the swimmer has a high-quality stroke model that can work at a variety of stroke rates or time parameters. Because then we can scale up that stroke to a variety of stroke rates and have a swimmer that can be very competitive across a number of different event distances. This is validated by Russell Mark, USA Swimming's high-performance consultant for their national team, and his work in analyzing the rare breaststroke swimmers that were equally successful across the 100-meter and 200-meter distances. He found that the speed and technique of the pull was exactly the same between the two races for these swimmers, with a slightly faster kick time in the sprint. The major finding was that swimmers were using more of a glide in the longer distance. This, combined with the observation that stroke rates for given races tend to fall in specific ranges, seems to validate the model's assumption that time is the parameter, while the underlying stroke characteristics of propulsion and drag remain consistent and constant across event distances. Unfortunately, this propulsion drag model is mostly theoretical and does not yet account for the effect of free speed off the start of the turn. It's difficult to quantify exact levels of propulsion or drag without expensive equipment. We can only observe the net effect using our stopwatches. However, different races have been shown to have different stroke rate ranges. And with my research, I've identified typical ranges of race-specific stroke length based on the height of the individual swimmer and the relative stroke length relative to height. Therefore, I believe that between relative stroke length and recommended stroke rates, that we have enough information to generate meaningful guidelines for both developing and executing optimal efficiency. In order to align my podium pathway with what was already done by Swimming Canada, I decided to use on-track times along with known stroke rate and relative stroke length data. When we observe that the greatest swimmers in the world fall into a narrow range of relative stroke length values that likely represent optimal development for a given event, we can create a progression towards those values using previously validated on-track times. The ranges of values described by this progression can be described as the RSLH versus age envelope for a given event. Let's illustrate this process using the women's long course 50-meter freestyle, which is a relatively simple event. This race consists of a start, an underwater component, and then a swimming component. The underwater component is encapsulated by the first 3.99 seconds of the race, with swimmers typically performing around 6 dolphin kicks. After this first segment, the rest of the race is a mad dash to the finish. Swimmers use exceptionally fast tempos to sprint to the other side in a blast of anaerobic energy. The typical range of RSLH is from 50 to 55% for women's 50-meter freestyle long course. The FINA 8 times, set by swimming's top international federation, FINA, are generally considered to be a definitive standard of elite swimming, as they provide entry into events like the Olympics or World Championships. They're defined as the 16th place time from the previous World Championships, so they represent a high standard of swimming. This FINA 8 time of 25.04 seconds also serves as the final on-track target for a female 50-meter sprinter in Canada. Given the start time of 3.99 seconds, the FINA 8 time would have 21.05 seconds of surface swimming. Using the range of 53 to 62 stroke cycles per minute, we can determine there to be a stroke count range from 37.2 to 43.5 strokes. Compare this to the first on-track time of 25.87 seconds, which has an extra 0.84 seconds of surface swimming for a total of 21.89 seconds. This means that swimmers would be taking an extra 1.5 to 1.7 strokes, ranging from 38.7 to 45.2 strokes. Between two swims, the distance gained from the underwaters may be different, but the size of the swimmer would generally stay the same. Therefore, the progression of relative stroke length is proportional to the stroke counts. If a swimmer is swimming 25.04 in the range of 37.2 to 43.5 strokes and an RSLH from 50 to 55%, then swimming 25.87 in a range of 38.7 to 45.2 strokes represents an RSLH ranging from 48 to 53%. Overall, this is a small difference. Although efficiency is not necessarily the most important piece of a 50 freestyle event, this example allows us to illustrate how relative stroke length can be progressed in the context of on-track times without adding other variables. Next, let's have a look at men's long course 200-meter freestyle. This example allows us to illustrate how relative stroke length can be progressed in the context of on-track times without adding other variables. Now, let's have a look at men's long course 200-meter freestyle, where some of the best swimmers show off their awe-inspiring combinations of speed and efficiency. What's nice about the men's 200-meter freestyle is that compared to the women's 50 freestyle, there is expected to be a much higher degree of improvement, 8.5% versus 3%, during the time that a swimmer is in the on-track system. This gives us a much greater opportunity and a much longer timeline to allow for true podium results tracking. It also helps that this event requires a balance of speed, endurance, and efficiency, so improvement in metrics like RSL matters. The men's 200 freestyle features a typical start time of 3.84 seconds, a typical turn time of 2.19 seconds, and a stroke rate range from 41 to 46 cycles per minute. We apply the same method to isolate the surface swimming times. The first on-track time of 147.06, which is reduced to 96.65 seconds of surface swimming. Over the course of the race, this is a total of 132.1 to 148.2 strokes, or 33.0 to 37.0 strokes per 50, which is how counts are usually quoted. Compare this to the first on-track time of 156.18, which is down to 105.77 seconds of surface swimming. Stroke counts range from 144.6 to 162.2 strokes, or 36.1 to 40.5 strokes per 50, a dramatic difference from initial numbers. An RSLH of 75% represents the most efficient swimmers in the dataset, the likes of Soon Young, Ian Thorpe, and Michael Phelps. These swimmers are universally regarded as some of the greatest middle distance freestylers of all time. We see the baseline RSLH on the first on-track time drop below 60%, which is less efficient than how some male swimmers swim the 50-meter sprint distance. This goes to show how targeted of a metric relative stroke length can be. Finally, using the on-track times, we are able to create the final envelope graph that describes the progression of relative stroke length with respect to height over the course of a swimmer's time within the on-track system. The reason why this underlying idea of positioning relative stroke length as the key factor is important because the difference between 156 and 147 can be entirely based on swimming efficiency alone. There will be swimmers that will dedicate countless hours on perfecting their starts, trying to get from 6.7 seconds down to 6.2 seconds, which are the expected 15-meter start times for 156 and 147 respectively. You can save half a second by working on your starts, or you can save the other 8.5 seconds by working on your swimming. Fortunately, the development of swimming skills and starting skills are not mutually exclusive, but we must understand where most of the improvement comes from. As coaches, we are always more interested in the practical application of the research than its theoretical components. Let's take a look at how relative stroke length can be used to generate meaningful metrics for our Canadian swimmers. Today, we'll be evaluating the state of Canadian men's 100-meter freestyle using the relative stroke length model with respect to swimmer heights. We'll be using benchmarks derived from high-caliber meets like the 2016 Olympics, European Championships, and the final of USA Olympic trials. This is a diverse data set that approximates swimming at the top 16 or FINA A level with progression towards medaling at major international events, top 3. Key metrics for this analysis will be stroke count, stroke length, RSLH, and stroke rate. Benchmarks such as stroke rate will be sourced from USA Swimming, but RSLH metrics will be scraped manually and calculated by myself in Google Sheets. The actual metrics themselves were gathered by myself using the CBC Canadian Olympic Trials livestream and my own equipment. We'll be able to plot multiple athletes against the RSLH versus age envelope and make some exciting observations. What we have here are a collection of summary metrics from the men's 100 freestyle final at the 2020 Canadian Olympic Trials, as well as the outline of the RSLH envelope, assuming that a time of 48.77 displays optimal relative stroke length with respect to height. The Canadian men's RSLH are typically at the low end of the desired RSLH range, with an average of 59.76%, excluding Cole Pratt and Marcus Thormeyer, who had too low of a stroke rate and would seem falsely inefficient. So I excluded them, falsely efficient, which is why I excluded them from those calculations. Michael Phelps had an RSLH of 70% on his American record men's 100-meter freestyle swim, and Nathan Adrian displayed an RSLH of 61% in his gold medal performance at London 2012 for the purpose of providing world-leading benchmarks. Although Joshua Liendo exhibited the lowest average RSLH, he still posted the fastest time. Him and Cole Pratt were tied for the youngest in the field, with their deficits in length or rate perhaps being due to inexperience in a trial's final environment. Generally, stroke rates fell into the expected range, besides Cole and Marcus, who are obviously more geared towards swimming the 200-meter events anyways. Although it's obviously a very small data set, stroke rate being negatively correlated to height would also support the hypothesis of relative stroke length with respect to height being an important metric. What's not shown in the table is that although RSLH was in a relatively narrow band, stroke counts were not. There was a range of stroke counts from 29 to 39, with underwater distances from 6.5 meters all the way up to 13.5 meters. RSLH only varied from 57.6 up to 61.1% for swimmers that swam at stroke rates within the expected range, and we know that the benchmarks for truly elite swimmers are from 60 to 70%. Finally, I wanted to plot the RSLH values produced by the athletes along the RSLH versus age envelope as a method of validating the podium results trajectory. There seems to be some degree of implicit progression over age. This doesn't mean that Joshua Lando has a bad skill set or that he is unlikely to improve. Rather, it means that he currently derives his performance from elements other than relative stroke length. He is known to have a truly excellent start, and it is more than enough to offset his deficits in RSLH as an 18-year-old. However, perhaps he could look to improve his RSLH over the next 3 years while maintaining his current strengths in starts and underwaters. Interestingly enough, this is basically the opposite situation to legendary Canadian sprinter Brent Hayden, who is known for his incredible swimming mechanics, but had to spend a lot of time in his career improving his dives. The average age for men's 200 freestylers that placed in the top 8 and top 16 in the World Champs and Olympic Games from 1988 to 2008 was 22.1 years old. Thus, with these ages, we create a podium results trajectory. Let's take a minute to review everything that we've talked about today. First, we described the podium pathway for swimming in Canada by identifying the relevant context in our specialized LTAD model. We understand the connection between the domestic program and the international program through the link of World Juniors and how Swimming Canada uses on-track times and race tech metrics to evaluate swimmers that participate at key national events. Next, we covered key performance metrics, initially providing a general overview of the types of metrics available to us in swimming, and then honing in on the metrics that appear to have the highest impact on race performance. We understand how stroke count, stroke length, and relative stroke length are all interconnected, and how these factors can be successfully scaled through stroke rate to a level that is appropriate for a specific event distance. Finally, we've looked at how to create trajectories towards podium performances using on-track times, from the simple example of the 50-meter freestyle sprint to the ultimate combination of speed, efficiency, and endurance, the 200-meter freestyle. In summary, relative stroke length is an interesting metric that can provide a podium pathway to international success for Canadian swimmers. Future work should be done to develop reliable guidelines for development in this area. Finally, I just wanted to highlight some of the miscellaneous sources that I've been referencing during this presentation. Many of these resources are actually internal USA swimming documents. Others are resources from the Australian Institute of Sport or national team documents for Swimming Australia. Most of these sources are no longer publicly available, as they were once posted on a public-facing website that was later set private or were sent to me directly by a member of their national team staff. So I thought I would include them in this presentation. Broadly, this presentation also makes use of information found in Swimming Canada's appropriate athlete development model and statistics found on historical versions of the SwimEE website. Other information, such as those used in race planning software, were gathered and processed personally by myself or reverse engineered from existing solutions. That concludes my presentation of podium results tracking for Canadian swimming. Thank you for watching.